Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside Dave Corbin. Glad to have you with us to explore the ideas behind today's episode.
My left eye sees pollution, those dirty fuels are burning, the earth's whole climate's churning, clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill, fossil fuels are cheap, wind and solar too steep, drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division, shuttered mind, worse than blind, 2020 vision.
Morning, Dave.
Morning, Matt. And it sure is early in the morning.
Bright and early, especially there.
Yeah. Price you pay for a podcast.
That's
6
right.
a.m.
Well, I appreciate the fact that, you want to guarantee the integrity of our master's picks. So, here we are Thursday morning early. A few people have teed off, I believe, but none of the favorites. So I think we'll be able to have a clean pick when we come to that later in the show.
Yeah, I was worried about that. Those first 2 holes, 3 holes, right, could make
Yep.
all the difference in the world.
Exactly. Well, good. So we are moving forward in our study of the early revolutionary period, and we're actually getting to the point almost when the war begins. So you may recall last time on our path to July 4th, 1776 and July 4th, 2026, we were looking at the work of the First Continental Congress, which met in September and October of 1774. And among other things, the Congress produced 4 documents, the most important of which we spent most of our time on, was called the Declaration and Resolves, which made the case against the intolerable acts in light of the laws of nature and English law, and attempted to draw a final line between local power and the powers of the Crown and Parliament. We've been talking about this really for a decade, going back to the 1760s, after the activity around the Stamp Act and the Stamp Act Congress. They argued in the fall of 1774 that American assemblies alone could regulate all internal affairs and taxes, that the Parliament could regulate foreign relations, including trade, so long as it didn't tax, and that the king had a right to exercise a reasonable negative, that is veto, on colonial legislation. So they weren't arguing for independence. They weren't trying to say there's no role for the Crown or the Parliament in American affairs, but they were clearly drawing a line between appropriate intervention in their affairs around taxes and internal regulation and the practice that had heretofore frustrated and challenged them by the Parliament and king over the last decade. And so one obvious question that arises out of that, well, what about the Crown's financial needs? Do Americans just don't have to pay any taxes to the general coffers and the needs of the empire? And their answer was no, we will voluntarily tax ourselves and give money to the Crown. We've done that before during the French and Indian War, for example, and we will do that again. But you can't tax us remotely for those purposes. So that's the Declaration of Resolves. The second document they produced was an address to the people of Great Britain, basically an appeal to both right and to the interests of those people, arguing that as fellow subjects, they had a common concern, or ought to have a common concern, with what was happening throughout the empire, and that the people in England should not look at what's happening in America with disinterest, but rather see that their own rights were on the line, and they ought to have sympathy for the things that Americans were going through. They also produced a loyalty address directed to the king, asking him to intervene as one who is just and patriotic, who believes in British law and constitution, maybe an idealized portrait of the king, but certainly one they hoped would attract his attention and his response. And then lastly, an address to the people of America. And we'll talk about that more next time, but basically wanting to help the American people understand why it was necessary to sacrifice in the ways that they were. So this is, again, September, October 1774. It takes some time. These Declaration and Resolves, their documents are sent across the sea. And the question is, how will Britain respond?
Interesting that one of our favorite American historians, Walter McDougall, comments on this response to the Intolerable Acts, and mentions that It's really interesting how Americans kind of go back to their roots, their Puritan roots here. He writes, a total embargo seemed doubly apt because it both hurt the venal British and called on Americans to practice the self-denial Calvinists and deists alike knew was the bedrock of liberty. Article 8 of the Continental Association, formed in response to the address to the people, went beyond abstention from luxuries to discountenance and discourage every species of extravagance and dissipation, especially all horse racing and all kinds of gaming, cockfighting, and other expensive diversions and entertainments, including the Masters tournament. No, I'm just adding that in. But,
Yeah, coming
but
soon.
you have an American sensibility that not only are we right, but we're going to have to practice great self-restraint to show that we were in the right. And this will come through right in the writings of Burke that we study for today. This special or unique understanding, self-understanding that we need to be exceptional if we're going to carry out this cause in the right way.
Yeah, unquestionably. And so, the Americans, while they're trying to exercise some self-restraint at home, then are appealing to their friends in England. And they do have friends in England, as we'll see, obviously, with our study of Edmund Burke's great speech for conciliation with America today, but also William Pitt, who goes back to the French Indian War, where he was a great hero. Of course, Pittsburgh is named in his honor. And the collaboration between the American colonists and British crown and military during the French Indian War was something, as we've talked about, that the Americans took pride in. They understood themselves to have contributed, perhaps beyond their proportions, beyond their appropriate weight to that victory over France and over their Native American allies. And so now William Pitt has become Lord Chatham, and he is in the House of Lords. And in January of 1775, so after those documents make it across the pond and there's some reaction and response to them, he proposes to remove the British troops from Boston. And basically says, look, we're in danger of bringing a war upon ourselves that he says would be disastrous simply to score a point of pride. We want to assert our rightful control over the people of Boston and America in general. And because we're proud, we're going to risk the whole empire. Well, how is that resolution received? Voted down 18 votes for, 68 against.
Not close, not close at all. I'm tempted now to call you Lord Parkham, but it's
Nice.
Matt Parks. So I think for this show anyway, you'll be Lord Parkham.
Very good.
Yeah, I mean, the context here is of what we're about to go through. It's March of 1775, so we're now about 16 months out from the Declaration of Independence. And the British probably understand, right, that it's do or die. Maybe not as much as the Americans do, but Edmund Burke comes to the forefront of the issue, gives a 3-hour speech in Parliament. Burke, of course, is the famous Irish statesman, political philosopher. And in this speech, he's going to first give an overview of the character of the American nation and the people. And then he's going to propose resolutions that hope to bring about conciliation with the Americans. Much like Lord Chatham's proposal that's voted down 18 to 68, Burke's plan is also defeated in the House of Commons, 78 for, 270 against. So it wasn't even close. But Matt, let's go through this speech. It's such a remarkable speech on so many fronts.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier in preparation of the show that, and you can say a little bit more about Burke. Burke is a great conservative thinker, and yet he's one that the causes that he takes up are the abuses of governmental power. That would be the case in India, of course, in his homeland, Ireland, and here in his argument that there should be conciliation with the colonies. Just quite remarkable, huh, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. And his speeches are rhetorically powerful and impressive, worth studying. I used to teach a class at King's called Rhetoric and Republican Government, and we would read primarily Burke and Lincoln. And you couldn't do much better than those two when it comes to statesmen who knew how to address the issues of their day and to really take what were momentary concerns in a certain sense and elevate them and show the underlying principle, the foundational appeal to justice that was required to really address those matters. Great models. How do you understand the moment? How do you understand the passing scene in light of eternal verities? And Lincoln and Burke are great exemplars of an ability to do that, which perhaps is rare to find historically and certainly in our own day.
Where have you gone, Edmund Burke?
Yeah, right. So the speech is long. I mean, as you said, 3 hours. In the Liberty Fund edition, it's almost 70 pages in length. So we obviously can't go through the whole thing. But about a quarter of the way into the speech, he begins to address the American character. And one of the major themes and arguments he's making is we have to understand the situation on its own terms. We can't create an American people to our own liking. We can't create a context or a relationship with America to our own liking. We have to take the facts as they actually are on the ground. And so he goes on for, again, 9 pages or so in that Liberty Fund edition, where he's describing the character of the American people. But he summarizes it all essentially in one phrase. He says, a love of freedom is the predominating feature which marks and distinguishes the whole. This is the essential thing you must know about the American people. And he says this fierce spirit of liberty is stronger in the English colonies, probably, than in any other people on the earth. So if you don't take that into account, he says, you have no hope of being able to work through this relationship and come to some reasonable conclusions, both in terms of what ought to be done and in terms of working out some arrangement that keeps the empire together. Now, from there, what he does is he unpacks then 6 different causes of this love of freedom. I think they're worth going through at least briefly here to see his analysis. And also as we think about where we are today, right, how do these 6 items still influence our ways of thinking? Is this love of freedom still something that would be the predominating characteristic of the American people?
Yeah, and it makes you think that, of course, world affairs are front and center on the newswire right now, and what's taking place in Iran and other places around the world. But the importance to Burke as a thinker to try to understand the people that you're dealing with at their core. And of course, that love of freedom is the defining feature, predominating feature, he says here. But why do they love freedom? So we ask the same thing of the Iranians. What is their predominating feature, and what is the cause of that predominating feature? And then how should that go into our policy regarding that country? It'd be an interesting parallel to write a similar essay today. But let's go through what he believes the causes are of the love of freedom within the colonies. First off, he says that the people of the colonies are descendants of Englishmen. England, sir, is a nation which still, I hope, respects and formerly adored her freedom. It's kind of interesting, right? He's a little jab against his fellow Englishmen, but we are English, and as Englishmen, there is a strain of English thought in which liberty is central to English ideas, central to English political principles. This has been a defining feature of us. We should not be surprised, therefore, that it's a defining feature of our colonies.
Yeah, I mean, just a very realistic assessment of things. Look, the people that came to America from England brought with them English ideas. And when did they come? They came, in many cases, during the English Civil War. They were there cheering on during the Glorious Revolution. I mean, they've been on this scene for a while. And so not only do they have that general love of English liberty, but they also have a particular concern about taxation. This is the particular way in which English liberty has been defended, going all the way back to Magna Carta. We're talking about 500 years plus at this point. So should there be any surprise that if Americans are going to be defensive with regard to their liberty, it's going to be on this very point regarding taxation, because they've been taught that by English history, by English precedent, by English law.
And the institutions that protect that love of liberty have also been central to English history. The right of election of magistrates, the balance of the several orders of the state. These are things that Burke mentions that have been part of English history that would very much be part of the political vocabulary of the American colonists. That they care about this principle, they care about the institutions, the structures and processes of government that protect this principle, and they're going to defend it in this case.
Yeah, exactly. And again, Burke says, why are you surprised? They've been tutored in your school.
Yeah.
So maybe you don't like the result, but you can't really complain about the character of a people that you shaped yourselves by your own institutions, by your own laws, by speeches, by celebrations, by the very things that you claim to define your character as a national people.
So I think there are two important points that are happening here, Matt, that we ought to bring to the attention of the audience. Number one, one of the jobs of political philosophy is to understand the nature of a regime, the character of a regime, and the character of a nation informed by that regime. So that's exactly what Burke is doing in this instance. But I think the second important point is when you go through that analysis, which is part of political philosophy, you have to take up organic history. It's not simply theorizing about something that is abstract. It's grounding your view of the thing in the history that has helped to form it. So he has both a philosophic orientation here and a historical orientation, which I think helps him.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's very characteristic of Burke throughout. I mean, this is someone who wrote an essay on the sublime. He was a philosopher, pure and simple, but also somebody who was in Parliament for many years and involved in public affairs in a very particular way, and so was able to move back and forth from those kind of general categories and to see how they applied in particular instances.
Well, the next category that he brings up in the speech is how religion also informs this free spirit. He writes later in the essay, religion, always a principle of energy in this new people, is no way worn out or impaired, and their mode of professing it is also one main cause of this free spirit. The people are Protestants, and of that kind which is the most adverse to all implicit submission of mind and opinion. This is a persuasion not only favorable to liberty, but built upon it. I do not think, sir, that the reason of this averseness in the dissenting churches from all that looks like absolute government is so much to be sought in their religious tenets as in their history. So there's a tie between Protestant Christianity and the love of liberty that Burke also notes.
Yeah, and he said, look, this is given the historical circumstances the Protestants found themselves in, they had to develop theories of resistance to authority. Now, they wanted to be submissive in all biblically appropriate ways, but they couldn't defer to the Pope. And in many cases, they couldn't defer to the local crown. They had to find shelter under alternative nobles, depending on the circumstances. And really, as you move through the 17th century, as you get through some of the great persecutions of the reformers, St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in France, for example, there becomes a development of a more acute sensibility of how do you relate to the state? How do you relate to authority? How do you understand the appropriate ways and forms of resistance? And so again, this is the religion that the American colonists brought to America. And so it says they're the Protestants of the Protestants. They're that level of dissent that's baked into the history of Protestantism is something that they carried with them to the shores of America. And again, began to form that national character, even when the idea of a nation was very far off.
So the love of liberty, drawn from the fact that they are originally British, the love of liberty, drawn from the fact that they are Protestant in their religious orientation, and then the third thing he points out here, which is very, very interesting, is how slavery plays into this love of liberty as well. He writes, there is, however, a circumstance attending these colonies, which in my opinion fully counterbalances this difference and makes the spirit of liberty still more high and haughty than in those to the northward. It is that in Virginia and the Carolinas, they have a vast multitude of slaves. Where this is the case in any part of the world, those who are free are by far the most proud and jealous of their freedom. Key line. Freedom is to them not only an enjoyment, but a kind of rank and privilege. So some of them, in being masters, know the difference between the status of the master and the status of the slave. And if they think that anything that's being done in these intolerable acts in the act of parliament over the past decade puts them in the place or rank of a slave, they're going to rebel against that as well.
Yeah, and you find this all over the speeches of the Southern statesmen, particularly, who raise concerns about their relationship with Britain. In fact, the very next day after Burke's speech, Patrick Henry gives his famous speech in Virginia, "Give me liberty or give me death." We'll look at that for at least a few minutes later on in the show. But yeah, that's the framework he uses. They're trying to impose slavery upon us. And of course, there were many who looked at this as deeply ironic that those who were masters who were enforcing the worst form of slavery upon the black population of the South were complaining about taxes of all things, right? And calling that slavery. But Burke says, I do not mean, sir, to commend purity of morality of this sentiment, which has at least as much pride as virtue in it, but I cannot alter the nature of man. So that this is a fact I have to deal with, whether it's commendable or not, and whether there's an analogy that ought to be drawn from this. Physician, heal thyself. You want to complain about slavery under taxation, do something about the slavery of those that are burdened much more heavily by your own behavior. Whatever the hypocrisy there that Burke understands and points out even here, the underlying fact is those Southerners are deeply conscious of threats to their freedom.
Yeah, and this is kind of a foreshadowing, this speech, in many ways, of the 20th century American historian David Hackett Fischer writes a book called Albion Seed, and Burke is picking up on what Fischer would say are the British folkways that's going to shape the American idea of who they are. And Fisher's argument, right, is that the four distinct types of liberty are found in the colonies. There's a kind of a Puritan understanding of liberty, primarily located in New England. There is more kind of an open-ended freedom of thought type of liberty that exists kind of in Pennsylvania and the Mid-Atlantic. The one that Burke has mentioned here is that kind of aristocratic liberty that's located in the Tidewater country, the Virginia, the Carolinas. And then, of course, there'll be a fourth type of liberty, which is kind of the Scots-Irish liberty that exists on the frontier. But for Burke, geography matters, right? And how people live and the institutions that they live by also affect their love of liberty.
Yeah, we see this in Tocqueville as well. Tocqueville says American civilization is at the intersection of the Puritan North and the slave-owning South. And Burke's making the same point. So the next to last point that Burke raises is the education of the American people. And very interesting here, he says, Americans study the law like no one else in the world. And so they're well equipped to use legal categories to press their concerns, to raise objections. Now, we've seen, as last time, that they don't just appeal to the common law or the English Bill of Rights or constitutional documents. They appeal to the natural law as well. But of course, that was part of the study of law too. And he notes that in America, there were almost as many copies of William Blackstone's commentaries on the English law sold as there were in England, even though the English population is several times that of the American population. And where does Blackstone begin? He begins with the absolute rights of Englishmen, and he's speaking in terms of the natural law, and not just the English law, which he says is built upon the natural law, but they would have been trained by Blackstone to understand the natural law as the foundation for whatever is best, at least in the English law. So they've studied the law in general. They've studied Blackstone, who's led them to certain conclusions about the nature of the English law, and they've drawn the applications that are natural from there. They take those principles and they say, okay, well, that means certain things for us. And you can try to argue otherwise, say, well, no, you've misapplied the premises. But they believe they've got some syllogisms regarding their rights and liberties as Englishmen abroad, if you will, that can't be gainsaid and that are very much in keeping with the tradition that's described and summarized in Blackstone, among other leading English jurists of the day.
Now, the last and final cause of what he calls here the disobedient spirit in the colonies is not merely moral, but it's laid deep in the natural constitution of things. What does that mean? Well, there's 3,000 miles of ocean between Britain and the colonies. So geography matters. If you're 3,000 miles away, you're going to be used to applying the principles that you've learned in Blackstone's commentaries in your real life. You're going to be used to administering over yourself. You've had practice in what it means to exercise independence, and that matters. And you've been kind of on your own in many ways, not completely on your own. I mean, of course, there's the French-Indian War and other interactions between the British and the colonies, but you've gotten used to the exercise of doing what men do when they rule themselves. So this too will have an impact on how the Americans love liberty.
Yeah, and there's no way around that. Now, technology has in some ways changed that, but only so much. I mean, obviously, communication, transportation are much faster, but it's still a challenge to project power across thousands of miles.
So these are the six causes of the American love of liberty. Where is Burke going to go from here then? So, I mean, when we move to what he proposes that the British do with the colonists, how do all these things play into a policy that Burke argues will be prudent for the British moving forward?
Well, I think you have to begin with where he wraps up this analysis and the challenge that he lays before the Parliament. So he's identified six causes. We've gone through those. He says, I do not mean to commend either the spirit in this excess, that is a spirit of liberty, that's so passionate on the American soil, or the moral causes which produce it. He's not trying to make a moral commentary on the American people. Perhaps a more smooth and accommodating spirit of freedom in them would be more acceptable to us. Perhaps ideas of liberty might be desired more reconcilable with an arbitrary and boundless authority. Perhaps we might wish the colonists to be persuaded that their liberty is more secure when held in trust for them by us, as their guardians during a perpetual minority, than with any part of it in their own hands. The question is not whether their spirit deserves praise or blame, but what, in the name of God, shall we do with it? And so this is the very practical type of statesmanship that we see from Burke over and over again. Richard Weaver has a great book on the ethics of rhetoric, and he says that Burke's primary or principal appeal was always to circumstances. And there's some difficulties with that. There's some limits to that. But here you see this appeal at its strongest. You may not like the American view. You may wish they were more willing to submit to our arbitrary government over them. And again, there's some irony deeply embedded in the way he describes the situation. But that's not the situation we have. So if you're a statesman dealing with relations between the American colonists and the British government circa 1775, you have to take this into account.
Very much tongue in cheek, right, Matt? I mean, because all of these things would be all these causes as to why they love liberty. And the fact that they love liberty would be something very appealing to Britishmen. So to say, well, I'm not going to make the argument for liberty, but you really don't have to, right? In the sense that it's very much in the blood of Britishmen to love these same things that Burke has spent so much time kind of going through. So it's hitting home. He loses, but it should be hitting home from a logical standpoint.
Yeah, and he makes that point very explicit at the end of this section. He says, in effect, we suffer as much at home by this loosening of all ties and this concussion of all established opinions as we do abroad. For in order to prove that the Americans have no right to their liberties, we are every day endeavoring to subvert the maxims which preserve the whole spirit of our own. To prove that the Americans ought not to be free, we are obliged to depreciate the value of freedom itself. And we never seem to gain a paltry advantage over them in debate without attacking some of those principles or deriding some of those feelings for which our ancestors have shed their blood. I mean, do you really want to argue someone out of their liberty? Do you really want to lay down the premises that would make that argument effective and strong? Do you want to trump these appeals to ancient rights and liberties, to the natural law, to a concern about consent and proper taxation? Do you really want to win that argument? Because once you've won that argument, how easy will it be for the next ministry to turn it around and apply it to you?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, just so powerful, so powerful. All right, so what's the plan? I mean, where are we going to go from here? And I hear he's just interesting. So what do we do now? Do we read Plato's Republic and come up with a solution, or Utopia by More, or Oceana by Harrington? No, you don't have to read any of these kind of theoretical texts on what justice is. You don't have to kind of embed yourself in theory, or what he calls the ancient constitutional policy of this kingdom. Let's kind of look at, what can be done. So Burke offers up 6 resolutions. So you have this kind of philosophic picture of how Britain should understand the situation of the colonies, the character of the Americans. But what are the 6 resolutions? And they end up being very commonsensical. So I'm going to run through them really quickly, 1 through 6. Resolution 1, that the American colonists with more than 2 million people have not been able to elect representatives to Parliament. Resolution 2, that they have been taxed without consent, to their consternation. Resolution 3, that no plan has been come up with to represent them because of the distance, the 3,000 miles between the British and the colonists. Resolution 4, that each colony has a legislature capable of taxing the people. Resolution 5, that they have been asked to give money to the crown in the past and have done so. And Resolution 6, that this is more beneficial and agreeable for the relationship between the colonies and the empire moving forward. So if we approve these resolutions, we should repeal the intolerable acts and move forward. In a sentence, Matt, Burke's common sense rectification of the problem is, if it isn't broken, don't fix it.
Right.
What do you make of that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a great summary, because what he's saying is up until 1763, all was well. Why was all well? Well, because you govern with a light hand, and because Americans were free to regulate their own internal affairs. They were free to tax themselves. They granted money to the crown when necessary, and it wasn't just during the French Indian War. I mean, there were a whole series of wars we've talked about in the past, from the late 17th century well into the 18th century. So this was not just a one and done kind of thing. We had a good relationship, 150 years worth of history there. And Burke says, you want to restore the old friendship, go back to the old terms.
Yeah, I think that it's really incredible just how you see the intersection of philosophy and practice, of theorizing, and then coming up with a solution that is workable on the ground. That really happens today, right? We tend to either be lost in abstractions, or we're so grounded in the nitty-gritty that we can't have any perspective beyond our particular situation. Just a marvelous speech, a marvelous exercise in rhetoric, and one that makes you think. And we'll talk a little bit about this in a couple minutes. Where is Burke today? Where have you gone, Edmund Burke? Why can't we do this today when we have policy issues that come before us? Zoom out, look at the thing as it is, and then zoom back in and come up with a solution that works on the ground. This is really interesting, right? So he delivers this speech to Parliament on March 22nd, 1775. The very next day in Virginia, Patrick Henry delivers his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. What do you make of the relationship between these two speeches, Matt?
Well, it's interesting because on the one hand, I think Patrick Henry clearly confirms some of what Burke has said. Obviously, the spirit of freedom runs strong in Patrick Henry. Now, there were others that he was opposing that were not so far along in their conclusion that perhaps the only way forward was through independence and through conflict. But Henry also demonstrates that it was a pretty late date if you're going to try to find a way to reconcile the colonies to the British Empire. Those like Henry were already thinking, you know what, we're past that point. We'll get there when we come to Common Sense by Thomas Paine beginning in January in 1776 in a few episodes. But Paine argues by that point, well, of course, once the fighting has actually begun literally in Lexington and Concord, Battle of Bunker Hill, the armies are organizing or in the field. Paine says, too late. There's no putting the genie back in the bottle. But Henry is saying as early as March 1775, even though there is no technical fighting just yet, that it's still too late to put the genie back in the bottle. There's armies that have been sent over, more soldiers being sent over. He asks, what are they doing? Why are they being sent? There's no French to subdue. There's no Native American tribes causing trouble on the frontier. So clearly they're there to subdue the American colonists. And if that's the posture the British government is taking, Henry says, Americans have got to wake up. They've got to realize that they can't just work this out. One more petition, one more resolution may not do it. And obviously, from the vote that's taken in the House of Commons on Burke's resolutions, we see that there was just not enough political will on that side either. So it may be that Burke's speech would have had fans in America, but they would have read the bottom line and said, yeah, 78 votes for, 270 against.
It would have been interesting, right, had Burke delivered the speech in the fall prior
Hmm.
and been able to have a little more support from the British Parliament. Might it have cooled tempers a little bit and really persuaded some Americans who are thinking through, I mean, what to do next, that they have an opportunity because there is going to be a fair statesmanship practiced, within Great Britain. But you're right. I mean, Henry says, I mean, we're at war. The time has come. The war has actually begun, the exact words he uses.
Hmm.
And the war would come, right? So as you mentioned, in 26 days, April 19th, which we celebrate in Boston with the Boston Marathon and Patriots Day, uh, they're getting ready to fight, and there will be a fight. All right, so we have Edmund Burke, we have Patrick Henry, and then we always try to apply what's going on in this colonial period to the present day politics. And the application I think is pretty clear. Like if we had to take a look at the American character today, which Burke does
Hmm.
in his speech, what are the key features of the American character? Do you have within the American people a love of freedom? And if so, what type of freedom? Are they of the Henry mindset, give me liberty or give me death? Where are we, Matt? I mean, let's take up the American left and the American right.
Hmm.
Where is most of the American left and the American right on these questions?
Yeah, I think that's a great framing of the question because, look, if Burke is the philosopher and Henry is the exemplar, we see a pretty consistent picture of where Americans were in 1775. Now, obviously, there's loyalists and there's others that are wanting to stay out of the way, but the people that have names that we know, those that shaped the course of the nation in the early days, were characterized by a love of liberty, a love of freedom. And so I think if you look at the American left today, you just don't see that. What you see is a love of a kind of equality, a kind of egalitarianism that really goes back, let's say, 120, 130 years, the progressive era, and the desire to basically delegitimize nature, to say, look, the nature is accident, and we want to fix nature. And so those that don't want to fix nature are benighted and who are standing in the way of progress. So there's a kind of a self-righteous element to it as well. And ironically, I think a kind of condescension toward the people that they at least present themselves as wanting to help. We see this pattern of condescension where they're sort of looking down their nose at middle America, looking down their nose at flyover America. And although in theory, these are people that should be their clients or constituents, they're always asking, what's the matter with Kansas? Why doesn't this group of people understand their interest and vote with us? And if they won't, then there must be something morally wrong with them.
But then on the right, I mean, I think you have likewise kind of self-elevating dominion that at least some on the right, right, that we're going to own the left and we're going to rid ourselves of these subversives and we're going to get back to some golden age where Americans were American. And I mean, part of that speaks to us, right? I mean,
Hmm.
I think we have a sense of being conservatives, but it depends upon what you want to conserve. I mean, do you want to conserve prudence, lawfulness, justice, equality, honor, rightly understood, th those things rightly, or
Hmm.
do you want to distort them, or even just forget about them altogether so they don't become part of how you talk to others and how you engage in public discourse in the public square? I think here, when you think of how Burke, might approach our current predicament, I imagine he'd use the same if he was writing a speech today. He'd use the same tools that he used in his speech back in 1775. That we have to look at the problem philosophically, understand, what are the ideas that shape both the new American left and the new American right, but then also kind of take a look at what's happened over time historically. I know you and I have tried to do this in our APTAP 1, 2, and 3 classes at the King's College. How did we get to this point? And why did we make the decisions that we did along the way to get to this point? So the dual use of philosophy and history to understand the ideas behind the current circumstances, and then the historical progress toward those circumstances. And I think that's a very powerful thing, Matt. I think that when you can run an individual who has an ideological streak through how their ideology was formed in the first place, how it changed over time, and what it's become, you might be able to grant to that individual, right, some nugget of justice kind of within the initial thought or idea, but show distortions of it and show distortions that are actually painful and problematic for the American regime. What do you make of that idea?
Yeah, I think that's a great approach. And one of the, I think, questions that you're left with Burke is, we've just said there's an American left and there's an American right. Burke in 1775 is saying there's an America. Now, again, that's the American patriots. They're the loyalists. So you could have said there was a left and right or whatever. There were two groups at that point. But the group that he had to deal with, they had to treat with, was the group of patriots. And so there was one framework he was able to use, North and South, despite differences, as we've already analyzed and as Burke himself articulates. Nevertheless, there's enough common theme there. And I think the challenge for the Burkean statesman today is to think about, how do I find ground that can be shared by those on the left and on the right? Not just because they have different premises, which obviously they do, and there's deep differences there in terms of how they understand human nature and the fundamentals of government, and lots of big questions on which they're divided, but also because they have this, both of them have this desire to win final victory. There's a scatological element to their approach to politics. So, use the word dominion on the right, right? It's not enough to win the election or to carry the point or to persuade. You want to humiliate in some cases. You want to dominate. You want to show your superiority. And the left, they wouldn't use that kind of martial language, but they would use moral language. They want to show their superiority, the moral superiority. So when you have two groups that look at the other as being not just somebody that has to be persuaded or a fellow citizen needs to be won over to the cause, but as an enemy that has to be defeated or shamed, it just becomes that much more difficult to figure out where that line of prudent statesmanship runs.
Well, really enjoying this series, and where do we go next, Matt? After Burke, what's our next discussion?
Well, we're going to keep moving our way through 1775. So we've talked about the First Continental Congress, and after the battles of Lexington and Concord take place April 19th, and then we have Bunker Hill, we begin to have the activity of the Second Continental Congress. And so we're going to see there's going to be more statements, more declarations. The first one, most important one coming out of the Second Continental Congress will be a defense of using arms. And still, not saying fighting for independence. I mean, that's the big question that's still lingering, even once the fighting begins. What are you fighting for? Are you fighting for your rightful place within the empire? Are you fighting to separate from the empire? And so, still, we'll see in the summer of 75 talking about that rightful place in the empire. They also write what's called the Olive Branch Petition, which is an appeal to the king, another appeal to the king, saying, look, we don't want to do this. We don't want to go down this road. Can you intervene? And then we'll see the king's response to that, which is not encouraging. So that's where we're going in the summer of 1775. And the other piece of this we want to pick up is the beginnings of this legitimate national government. Burke gives some hints of this. He says, we got rid of government in Massachusetts. He says, anarchy is found tolerable. That's not supposed to be the case. The Americans were able to organize themselves there in Massachusetts, but then he also refers to the Continental Congress. Here's a gathering that they just spontaneously created. And so how is it that this group begins to exercise sovereign power with the consent of the people? Theory and action is really taking place here. And so we're going to talk more about that process of how that national body came to speak rightfully and legitimately for the American people before they even knew they were an American people, before they were even thinking as a national body. Nevertheless, we have leaders that are emerging who are working to establish what will become the rudiments of the United States American government.
Well, speaking of something lacking dominion or encouragement, as we move to Tocqueville's crystal ball, March Madness happened, but we won't go through how poor our picks were.
Wow, not good.
It was a mess, but
Your
and
daughter won
we'll
the
maybe talk.
bracket, though.
I mean, it's I know I haven't heard the last of it all week.
I'm sure.
Yeah, but we won't talk about the Red Sox either. What are they, 4-8 right now? But
Yeah.
still a lot of season left. But we're going to move on today to the great Masters golf tournament that has 91 players in it. And what we want to do is, well, here's the funny thing. We taped the show yesterday before the beginning of the Masters at about 6 a.m. Mountain Standard Time,
Hmm.
and we had some technological difficulties. So, and it's good for our picks that we had technological
Right.
difficulties because they were not good. So we're going to pick a winner. We're going to get a second bite of the apple to pick a winner, to pick a surprise top five, and then a disappointment. And it'll be you won't know what we picked before, but hopefully we'll have one day in and we'll be better at this. So who is your winner? Who is your surprise top five? And who is your disappointment?
Okay.
Feel
Well,
free to change them from yesterday. No one knows.
yeah, we won't mention my Matt Fitzpatrick pick. That was
Okay.
not looking good. I'm not sure he's going to make the cut. So yeah, I mean, if I'm looking at the leaderboard now, I like guys like Koepka, Scheffler looking good. I think I'll take Shane Lowry as
Okay. The Irishman.
the Irishman. Yeah, he's always entertaining, and I think he can, finish the job here at the Masters.
I have one said on the show, never choose anyone but Scheffler. And I'm going
Yeah,
back to that. Okay, so Scheffler will be the winner. How
Scheffler the
about
winner.
your surprise top five?
All right, I'm not changing there. I had Chris Goddard up, and he's doing all right. He's up there under par. So let's go, Chris.
All right. I'm not going to change mine either. I said Jordan Spieth, and I think he was even yesterday, tied for 17th. So, and always kind of seems to play well sometimes in these tournaments on the Sundays. So, Jordan Spieth is my surprise top five. Disappointment. Now, don't even mention who your disappointment was. I'll give a hint. He's at the top of the leaderboard today.
Yeah, yeah, the defending champion who's also leading. So maybe not. No, I think that obviously John Rahm and DeChambeau would be the easy choices at this point. But somebody else who's maybe expected to do well, I'm going to say someone like Justin Rose, who's off to a good start. I think he slips and falls down the leaderboard by the end of the tournament.
I'm going to choose the person as a disappointment who I chose as the winner.
There you go.
Because he was a disappointment. That's Patrick Cantley. I think he's six over. So it'll be a disappointing tournament for him. But always fun to watch, especially if you're in northern parts because you see green grass and you're like, wow, there is such a thing as summer on the horizon.
That's right. Yeah, little hint of that and what's coming. We've got a few weeds growing in the yard at this point, but the grass isn't quite there yet. So, well, good. Thank you for accommodating us. Yeah, this is a little operator error on the record button on my part that brought us back for a second round here. As always, great to be with you as we work our way through these early American documents. Look forward to connecting again soon. You can reach out to us at democracyinamericatoday@gmail.com. You can also follow us on YouTube and Instagram, and we'll talk to you again soon.